posted onto our website along with the presentations. As always, be aware of your surroundings and make sure you have proper. So attendees are muted to begin with. If you would like to speak, either use the raise hand function, or you can also ask a question. Please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. There are two options, so please try to not to use the chat, just the Q&A. We'll answer. You can answer either through the chat, or we will answer it. And then if you are speaking, we'll move you to the panelist during your time speaking. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. We can move on. All right. These are general ground rules. Just be friendly and respectful. We're trying to sure everyone understands the proposals, gets their questions answered. And then, as I said, keep the questions in the Q&A. Refrain from using the chat. So this is today's workshop. As you know, it's been shortened since we will not be presenting the LOL study since it hasn't been released yet. We'll be scheduling another workshop for that later this month. So for today, we'll mostly be focused on demand related issues and behind the meter. And then next, ahead, just for a reminder, this workshop is, go to the next slide. Early February with the workshop, we have comments coming up February 14th, followed by replies on the 25th, leading toward our June decision. So to our first presentation, which is Maria Mozapari from Energy Division.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you've all had a great start of the day. As you saw, we have a morning full of complex proposals, but the good news is we have a non-complex, non-controversial proposal. Those don't happen often, to ease you into the day. So with that, let's start. Next slide, please. So our proposal is on the third-party demand response testing requirements. In 2020, an RA decision established testing requirements for the third-party DR resources procured by non-IOU LSCs. The DR resource must dispatch for 4 consecutive hours during the RA measurement hours in every quarter of each year. The test must be done at the resource level ID, and all resources within the same sublab should be dispatched concurrently. The scheduling coordinator shall submit the test results to the DR buyer, the DR provider, Energy Division, and the California ISO by the end of the quarter following the quarter in which the test dispatch occurs. And then lastly, the third-party DRP providers shall submit the test results in their load impact protocols and reports submitted to the Commission annually. So these are the aspects of the existing testing requirement for the third-party DR resources, and we're going to have, we're proposing a few modifications / clarifications to this testing requirement. Next slide, please. So the first item on the proposal is to standardize the testing requirement across LSCs. As I mentioned, the decision established the testing requirement for third-party DR resources procured by non-IOU LSCs, and Energy Division is proposing to apply the third-party DR testing requirement to all third-party DR resources, regardless of the buyer of the resource. This is to achieve consistency in the testing requirement policy, regardless of the buyer of the resource, and also to create a level playing field in the RA market between the IOUs and the non-IOU LSCs when it comes to buying these resources. The second item is the timing of the quarterly test. So the decision required all resource IDs within the same sublab to dispatch concurrently. However, the month within the quarter to perform the test was unspecified. There are instances where the monthly QCs vary within the quarter, and we're proposing that for those instances where the qualifying capacity value in the sublab vary monthly within the same quarter, the test be conducted in the month with the highest aggregated QC for each sublab. This would alleviate the need to test every month when there are different QCs per month in the same quarter. And then lastly, the hourly test results. The decision required all resources to be dispatched for 4 consecutive hours during the RA measurement, and then for the performance to be averaged over the same period. We're proposing to clarify that while the performance could be averaged for the 4 hours, the results that are being submitted to Energy Division, the buyer, and the California ISO must be in hourly format. Next slide, please. This is basically the proposal in practice. This is how the 3 items will change the red line, or we'll create red lines in the ordering paragraph. So again, pretty non-complex clarifications / modifications with that. And these are the 2 ordering paragraphs from decision, the 2020 decision. And with that, as I promised, simple, non-controversial, we're done with this proposal. And I'm here if there are any questions.
Hi, this is Luke Tugas from the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for this presentation. Appreciate it. A few clarifying questions and then a statement, I guess. First of all, does this apply to the DRAM, DRAM resources or just RA contracts?
No, this maintains the application for the resources initially designed in the decision. So that was for third-party resources minus the resources in the DRAM pilot. So that still applies.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. And then in regard to the second element, I think I'm clear about this. I just want to ask the question to make sure I'm 100% clear. Does the maximum QC value for a given quarter, is that applied at the resource level or at a DR provider's portfolio level?
It would be at the aggregate QC per sublab. So the highest QC in the sublab.
Highest QC. Okay, so if they have like, I'll just choose a simple example: 3 resources, 2 are in one sublab, and then 1 is in a second sublab, and then it would be basically the month at which the actually, okay, I understand. Actually, this makes sense to me. Thank you.
Sure.
And then one final question. This is a higher level question. I don't see any huge problems, with this proposal. It makes sense to me to clarify these aspects. But we were surprised to see this proposal because, in the council's comments on the preliminary scoping memo, we had requested specifically that the scope be open, that the scope include changes to these testing rules. And the reason why is that you might recall in the 2020 decision, the commission laid out 2 tiers of testing, and there's a tier for, and I'm not trying to put words in the commission's mouth, but basically, just to paraphrase, a high risk and a low risk tier. And the high risk tier was going to require quarterly testing, and the low risk tier was going to require biennial testing. but the commission did not, as you probably recall, the commission did not lay out rules for how a DR provider can graduate from the high risk to the low risk category. What the council wanted to do in this proceeding was to submit a proposal that lays out the process for this graduation. But again, the scoping memo in our interpretation, and I took another look this morning, it doesn't even touch on this DR testing issue. So given that the Energy Division has put forth a proposal on this topic, could the council, would we be allowed to submit our own proposal on this along with our comments on the 14th?
I don't think I'm the right person to respond to the process question, but my understanding would be this specific proposal wouldn't preclude any further modifications to the testing requirement policy. What this one is doing is, to the extent this is staying as is, these are the clarifications for the existing policy. Now, whether there are proposals on, or whether there can be proposals on the existing policy to modify the actual policy, I will leave that to the RA team to respond to, because that's a process question on the RA proceeding.
Got it. Well, in my view, I don't see the distinction here, because if the scoping memo did not explicitly allow any proposals on the DR testing topic in general, whether they're clarifications or further development of the rules, the fact that Energy Division submitted their proposal on this topic that again was not included in the scope, it seems it would be fair to me to allow parties who do want, who originally intended to submit such a proposal, be allowed to do so as well. And I know you don't have to comment on that. I'm just making that statement. Thank you.
I think if you're responding to this this proposal, you can certainly propose alternatives in your comments.
Thank you, Simone. I mean, obviously, I don't think we would propose alternatives, but I do get your point, though. Perhaps we could frame it in a way that, oh, okay, this, we will submit our comments on this particular proposal, but in addition, we think that we should also be adding these other rules as well, and maybe that's the way to frame it.
This is Paul Nelson on behalf of the California Large Energy Consumers Association, or CLECA. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. CLECA definitely understands the need for testing, so that you get an accurate estimate of what DR can do. But it's obviously a balance against, the burden on the customer. And for industrial customers, a 4-hour test 4 times a year, they're going to have to look at it. When I shut down an industrial process and lose the manufacturing of what I'm doing, there's a cost associated with that. And it's obviously, well, what's the incentive? And so if you're going to look at 4 tests per year for 4 hours, that's going to could impact, the receptiveness for industrial customers to participate in these DR programs. And I think what Luke mentioned is, is the concept is sort of a track record. If a program perhaps has had good tests, and perhaps they look at, customer enrollment, that they've had the same customers in a program, perhaps, you reduce the testing requirements for those providers and programs that have a track record. I mean, what's the Energy Division's thought of that sort of concept? Is that something that would be acceptable?
I think that was something that was discussed in the previous decision as the 2-tier one. My understanding is we have not created the details of the 2nd tier yet. I don't know which track parties were supposed to come in with details for that. So I think that's still open, to my understanding, from what I remember from the decision.
Yeah, so the idea is it wouldn't eliminate testing, but maybe we get down from 4 to 1, test per year. And I guess one clarification I want to have on this: if there was an event in a quarter, does that then replace the need for a test? So if you had a call event in a quarter, then you don't have to do a separate test. Is that part of your proposal as well?
Well, again, my read of the proposal, the existing proposal, would be if the event matches the parameters of the requirements within the testing requirement, I think that should be okay. If there is a 4-hour event, to me, that could definitely be used as a test.
Okay.
If there's a 4-hour event in the sub lab with the highest QC, of course, all the four different criteria are met. Yes, I think that would alleviate the need for a parallel test.
Okay. So I guess the kind of remaining question again, I guess, this tiers or track record, I guess, is I'm not clear on sort of what the process it would be to develop that. That's not clear to me on how that would, the steps going forward. So.
Honestly, I have to go back to the decision. I don't recall. I remember that the RA decision established the 2 tiers, but I don't remember which venue or timeline was designed or designated for the second tier, for the details of the second tier. So I can look into that later.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Paul, this is Natalie. I have some recollection that some of the tests in other programs and utility programs usually do occur, in fact, during events during the year. And so I think that, they tend to be pulled closer to the summer months, but it should not be a problem to be able to conduct a test because there are events that occur during those same months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I know for the utility programs, they typically will do a test if they haven't had an event. Of course, these are for third party, and of course, my concern is if the third party programs want to attract industrial customers, I think a pathway forward is there a mechanism to reduce the testing to get that industrial participation through third party programs? So.
I understand.
Yeah.
And after you ask your question, please lower your hand so we can tell if you have another question or not. Next, let's go to Alan Meck.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric. I'm just curious, is this requirement also being placed on, so I'm thinking specifically about the base interruptible program, is this requirement also being placed on utility procured DR? So would BIP customers who are directly recruited by the IOUs also have to comply with this 4 times a year testing? So I just want to make sure that there's parity,
I think this applies to third-party DR resources, so not the IOU resources. BIP is considered an IOU resource.
Right, but there's also third-party aggregators who participate in BIP.
Correct. However, BIP is being bid into the market by the IOU, correct?
Yeah.
So it's essentially an IOU, or the way it's looked at the commission is BIP, CBP, these are IOU resources, although they're being brought in by the third parties. So this would mostly apply to if you were to go and procure RA on the market from third party resources. So if CCAs or the IOU would go into the market and buy RA products from third party resources, this would be the testing for them.
You might want to draw that distinction more explicitly, though, because the way this is worded, that it looks like you're discriminating against third-party aggregators who bring in BIP.
Sure. So we didn't have that confusion in the original language, but let me look into it. And if you think if you have a proposal for, or a deadline that you think will make it more clear, we can probably include that. But I know that in the initial decision, we didn't have concerns about that confusion being raised, but we can definitely look into it.
We're waiting for Anya. Maybe there's a question in the Q&A from Maria Bolenki. She said, from what I
sure.
remember.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were waiting for me, but good morning. This is Anya Gilbert with the KISO. Just wanted to offer support for this proposal. I think this is an area where this type of testing and applicability, especially for 4 hours, represents the market conditions and duration of dispatch we might see. So just wanted to thank the Energy Division for putting this proposal forward. Thanks.
So Maria said that from what she remembers, these proposals were supposed to be examined in track 4 of the prior RA proceeding, but was never scoped in, and it wasn't scoped into the implementation track, so they're unclear of the avenue to get the hierarchy defined. Do you have any response for that, Mariam?
Sure. So I think this is addressing the tier 2, and that was apparently supposed to be discussed in track 4. Again, this is not something I can respond to right now. I would have to take it back and discuss it internally with Energy Division and potentially the judge to see where and when is the appropriate venue to discuss the tier 2. But thank you. I'll make a note that this was supposed to be in track 4.
Okay. Not seeing any other questions at this time, so thank you, Mariam. I think we can move to the next presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Is the joint DER parties.
Hi, everybody. This is Kate Unger. I'm a senior policy advisor with the California Solar and Storage Association. And I'm going to start our presentation with some foundation and brief summary and then kick it off to my colleagues. So the joint DER parties, you can just leave it on the first slide there, thanks. We're the California Energy Storage Association, NLX North America, Sunrun, and CALSA. And we're presenting today on a report and proposal that are part of our continuing effort to move forward with establishing a methodology for dispatchable behind-the-meter storage and hybrid resources to qualify for resource adequacy. And we wanted to start with a problem statement that we're hoping to address, which is the current process for calculating RA for behind-the-meter resources doesn't account for exports from storage devices. The existing PDR model recognizes load reduction only, and PDR and current QC methodologies don't value exports, which means that there's significant stranded or underutilized behind-the-meter battery export capacity value. And solving this is an important piece of enabling those resources to more fully contribute to the reliability of our grid. Behind-the-meter virtual power plants have a lot of potential and value that isn't being realized right now. And we are open to having exports valued under the PDR model, but it hasn't proven feasible so far. And so that's one avenue that we hope we can pursue. There's also the distributed energy resource provider, DERP model. It's another potential avenue. It's created in 2016, but isn't utilized. And one of the major limiting factors is the lack of a QC methodology. In 2020, FERC Order 2222 required all ISOs and RTOs to develop a DER participation model to open up market pathways for DER aggregation, including for DERs that are capable of injections into the grid. Establishing an upfront QC for behind-the-meter storage and hybrids, inclusive of export to the grid, will drive design decisions in the deployment of storage in a way that's more helpful to the grid. That would support long-term investments and bring more resources online that can support the grid. So our goal is to evolve the resource, make it more useful for the grid and the market. We know that customers will increasingly invest in dispatchable mobile and stationary storage, and that capacity should be available to the market. Next slide, please. So our report and proposal was submitted on January 21st. The report covers in good depth 8 barriers that were identified in Decision 21-06029, which the Commission has said should be addressed as part of the work to increase the value and leverage the capabilities of behind-the-meter storage and hybrid resources. It includes our recommendations based on current law and policy, existing Commission decisions and policy, the work and recommendations of prior working groups in fora, including the IDER, multiple use applications, SGIP proceedings, and FERC Order 2222. And the report gives recommendations for all of the barriers. The proposal covers specific proposals for 5 topics: qualifying capacity methodology, must offer obligation, incrementality, deliverability, and sale for resale. And D21-06029 invited us to undertake a working group to develop a proposal that addresses the 8 issues. And we're holding a series of workshops. We've had 3 already, at which we've spent significant time on the 8 barriers. This presentation, we wanted to focus on the proposals. We do have more workshops planned. The next 2 working group meetings will dive deeper into specific topics, and information on those will be announced to the service list, as well as touched on by my colleagues. And I will now turn it over to one of them. I believe it is Mark who's up.
Yes, thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. Mark Mambuket with NLX. So before we launch into a discussion of the proposals, wanted to quickly review the 8 barriers as initially laid out in the prior to June RA decisions. So first, the forward determination of capacity associated with renewable production, consumption, charging, and export. Second is RA requirements associated with customers providing capacity. Third is wholesale market participation, including metering, dispatch, control, and communication with KISO. The fourth is cost for energy associated with consumption, charging, and export. Fifth is changes such that NEM and SGIP resources are compensated for capacity while discounting for their NEM and SGIP compensation as necessary to ensure the resources do not receive compensation beyond their value. Sixth is load forecasting and adjustment for behind-the-meter resources. Seventh is interaction of such resources with existing behind-the-meter resources such as PDR. And eighth is deliverability determination. So again, we're not going to structure this presentation to go through these as we have in the prior 3 workshops, but suffice to say, as we move forward, our proposal and the recommendations cover the roughly 7 out of the 8 of these barriers. And the only questionable one that we're recommending to remove is number 7, interaction of resources, existing resources such as PDR. So to launch into a discussion of our recommendations, I will pass the baton to Rachel McMahon.
Hi, everyone. Ours too is a very non-controversial proposal, which should go quickly. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, thanks very much for the opportunity to present today, and also for those who have joined our workshops. We've gotten a lot of very helpful feedback. So I'll start with our proposal on qualifying capacity methodology. So as we included in our proposal on January 21st, our initial recommendation is to set the qualifying capacity methodology for standalone storage and storage hybrids as equivalent to their front-of-meter counterparts. What we have quoted here is from the PUC's 2020 qualifying capacity methodology manual for both types of resources. And we would further recommend, and I won't read what's on the slide, but we would further recommend that if this methodology were to change with the adoption of slice of day or any other proposal, that the initial QC for behind the meter move with it. So we're not necessarily recommending a separate valuation methodology for behind the meter, standalone storage, and hybrids, as, for example, exists now for demand response resources that go through the load impact protocol, which is very different from the valuation of other resources. And as Kate mentioned, we recommend that the qualifying capacity value for behind the meter storage and hybrids be inclusive of battery exports, and that retail and wholesale settlement be at the battery inverter rather than host load. And this is something I should say that within the KISO market and under proxy demand response, there is a methodology for doing this. It's called the MGO methodology, or the meter generator output methodology. A similar methodology for behind the meter resources does not exist at the retail level. We are continuing to talk to the investor and utilities about that, and have had some discussion in our prior workshops. So while we've learned that and we know that this methodology or capability doesn't exist today, we have discussed the fact that the Commission has adopted submetering methodologies for the emergency load, or rather directives to develop submetering methodologies for behind the meter resources under the Emergency Load Reduction Program. So options A4 and A5 for virtual power plants and electric vehicles. And we recommend that to first focus on those as the basis, which we do understand are in development. So next slide. Okay, so as I said, this was our initial recommendation. We've had a lot of discussion within our workshops and a lot of feedback both offline as well. And something that we're considering is how to best account for on-site load consumption of storage discharge, and in the case of hybrids for solar and storage production, and essentially evaluation of the load drop plus the export. Our complication here are the things that we're thinking through. Is we don't want to create an overly complex methodology. And we note that the distributed energy resource provider model actually uses the NGR participation model, so the non-generating resource, which does not include baselining. And we'll further discuss and dive into this at our February 8th working group meeting. And we welcome, after we get through this presentation, we welcome any constructive ideas that any of today's workshop participants have in this regard. But just know that we are thinking about it and trying to sort through the best way to account for on-site consumption of storage so that there isn't essentially a double counting. And then here we also have charging sufficiency considerations. So for standalone behind the meter storage, we recommend that behind the meter standalone energy storage resources demonstrate excess energy is available in other non-shown slices to fully charge the resource and ensure its qualifying capacity. For hybrid behind the meter energy storage resources, we also recommend that these resources should account for on-site charging availability from its paired generation resource before determining and accounting for any additional excess energy needs, if any, from the grid. And we make these recommendations also to align with the slice of day proposal. And I should note, actually, when we say that we're considering essentially modifying our qualifying capacity recommendations, we are looking to submit a revised report. We had first requested from the judge for this proceeding to be able to submit our proposal a bit later in March to have time to work through some of these issues. And we're directed to submit on January 21st, which we did. But that also meant that we ran out of time to fully consider certain issues. So we are we fully intend to submit a revised proposal based on the comments that we receive, both within the workshops, the conversations that we have, and then the comments that are filed on February 14th to submit a revised proposal in our reply comments. So just wanted to put that out there. Next slide. So incrementality. So there is a need for a universal incrementality framework for distributed energy resources, as well as for front of meter resources providing multiple services. So the multiple use application framework that was adopted by the Commission in 2018, it was kind of a generalized guidance for incrementality based on services. We understand that may be taken up in a future Commission rulemaking, but we do not recommend that the resource adequacy docket take up a full incrementality framework for services. But we do also point to some precedent for how to treat net metered resources and SGIP resources in IDER solicitation. So I'll just read here. A commitment of SGIP capacity to meet dispatch requirements should be considered an incremental service above and beyond what is compensated via SGIP, and the IOU should be required to treat any SGIP incentivized storage project that provides the services they are soliciting as wholly incremental. And the IOU should give the provider the full payment for services procured irrespective of any additional SGIP incentives payment the provider may receive. And specific to net metering, projects already compensated through NEM should be considered fully incremental for the purpose of, and this is from the IDER solicitation or IDER decision, should be considered fully incremental for the purposes of bids and deferral tariff offers if the DER provider makes material enhancement to provide IOU solicited deferral services. So essentially, if a NEM resource, the way that this works in practice is that if a NEM resource adds storage, then it's the storage that counts. So we looked not only to, and also I should say, there's also been clarity provided in the SGIP proceeding and other places that the collection of an SGIP incentive does not necessarily confer provision of services, that these two are distinct. And so based on this precedent, as well as, based on these precedents with an IDER, I'm sorry, I'm reading Mark's chats. Based on this prior Commission precedent, we made our recommendations for qualifying capacity value under our proposal. So next slide. Okay. So our recommendations are as follows. So first, instances in which incrementality considerations are relevant. So first, for net metered customers, we propose that the qualifying capacity value for the resource be the same as that for standalone storage, and no renewable production be considered in the QC calculation. So this is consistent with precedent, and it also removes any question around double counting of capacity. And second, for adjustments to the forecasting process, and I should mention that we have ongoing conversations with the CEC in this regard. And these are sort of our initial recommendations, which would certainly change as we further develop through their next IPER cycle. But first, to allow load serving entities to adjust load forecasts based on up-to-date assumptions around new DER deployments and operations, either as load modifiers or supply resources. And second, overall encourage increasingly granular DER data to inform forecasts. For example, incorporating sub-metered behind-the-meter resource data and CEC forecasting to assess ex-post load impacts. Instances in which incrementality considerations are not relevant. So the collection of a storage or renewable energy technology incentive. So as I mentioned, at least in the case of SGIP, the Commission had found previously that the collection of an SGIP incentive does not equal a provision of services, so the two are distinct. So such incentives include, but are not limited to, the Self-Generation Incentive Program, the Solar and Multifamily Affordable Housing Program, Multifamily Affordable Solar Housing, and any successor renewable energy or storage incentive program, insofar as these programs do not require dispatch in response to electric system needs. And second, the provision of other non-resource adequacy services, including but not limited to distribution level services and customer level services such as backup power and resiliency, consistent with the rules and guidance under the multiple use application framework. Next slide. Okay, and with this, I'll hand it back to Mark.
Thanks, Rachel. So moving on to the must offer obligation. So we are recommending that it largely dovetails off of comparable requirements for the PDR model, corresponding with times when the resource is expected to be needed the most or contracted for under slice of day. Currently, this is indicated by the availability assessment hours set from 4 to 9 p.m., while also adhering to the 24/7 bidding obligation. Resources must be able to be dispatched at least 3 consecutive days a month, or at least 24 hours a month, and at least 4 hours per dispatch. Finally, resources are subject to the RA availability incentive mechanism. So we would recommend this carryover as well to the extent that this persists under slice of day. Next slide, please. And these next 2 topics have been covered throughout this effort by Jano from CISA. And he is not able to join today, but I'll be able to give the high level rundown, and hopefully we can all answer any questions that come up. So moving on to deliverability, our proposal includes recommendations for modifying the deliverability process and study methodology, but ultimately this will require refinement through a KISO initiative. So the current cluster study and deliverability allocation process works well for single site in front of the meter projects, but it does not work for multi-site DER aggregations. There's little incentive or ability for a single DER customer to subject itself to a 2 to 3 year cluster study process, followed by additional years to await any upgrades and construction if those are triggered. Also, the existing commercial viability criteria to request and retain deliverability, such as site control or an executed PPA, do not apply as apples to apples to single customer DER sites. So our overall sense is that behind the meter aggregations for RA with export will not be procured under this process. So our proposal contains a recommendation for a more proactive approach and a different process for assessing deliverability for DER aggregations. The proposal is to study aggregated DERs at relevant distributed generation deliverability nodes, or DGD nodes, and proactively identify, build, and allocate any T&D upgrades to LSEs who have an interest in or have contracted with the DER aggregation, with those costs being further allocated, or the potential for those costs to be further allocated to the DER aggregation upon enrollment through a program or a contract. So again, specific technical details and processes will need to be determined in a KISO initiative and in Rule 21 proceedings, which are typically out of scope for the RA proceeding. Our main recommendation here is for the CPUC to adopt the QC proposal while directing further action on this in respective proceedings such as Rule 21 and at KISO. And determinations made in these other fora will determine how the QC value is adjusted to an NQC value for operation in the program. Next slide, please. So finally, on sale for resale, this is another area that will require additional work beyond this proceeding. Overall, we'd like to get to a place where we can delineate between wholesale versus retail charges for charged energy behind the meter. And our proposal discusses a few options on how to achieve this. Ultimately, though, we'll need to develop accounting frameworks and sub-metering protocols in order for this to happen, likely in a separate rulemaking. And this will take time to develop. So an interim step would be to maintain the quote unquote keep all things retail policy and develop contracting structures to expose behind the meter hybrid and standalone storage resources to wholesale prices for to guarantee optimal dispatch of energy. For instance, PG&E has a contracting option in place that would allow a premium capacity payment for the storage unit under the long-term RA agreement with energy settlement contract, which ensures optimal dispatch of the resource with no net sale of energy. Any energy settlement under this type of approach would need to be rebated back to the LSE, since the premium capacity payment assumes some level of KISO arbitrage in contracting for the DER aggregation. With that, I believe that concludes our presentation, and we are happy to go into questions and discussion. Oh, I guess one last note here, we've included the logistics for the next 2 informal working group meetings that we have scheduled, and hopefully everyone should have an invite for those already, but in case you don't, here's the information.
And before we open it up for more questions, one thing that we wanted to mention is that there are many things, and we've highlighted some of them. Some of them we haven't gotten into deeply, for example, like the interconnection process, et cetera. But we do realize that there's a lot of work that needs to occur in order to bring these resources into the market. And so what we're asking this proceeding to do is to set the initial qualifying capacity value so that we can then work towards deliverability, so that we can work on all these other issues. But right now, we're just sort of starting from nowhere, to be honest. And with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Go to Alok Gupta. You should be able to, there you go.
Hello? Yeah, hi, this is Alok Gupta, Energy Division. I guess I have a couple of questions, but obviously don't want to use up all the time. So on the deliverability slide, I was a little confused. Are we assuming Rule 21, or are you assuming some new interconnection process yet to be defined?
We're assuming Rule 21, ideally. We don't think the WDAT works well for behind the meter resources. However, we do realize some modifications need to be made for Rule 21. As I read the tariff, it explicitly does not allow for wholesale market participation. So that is one of the additional things that we would need to be developed, but in a different PUC docket.
Okay. And then in terms of market model, so it sounds like some variation of Rule 21, but as far as the market model, are we assuming PDR or some variation of PDR?
We're assuming the DERP model. So, and Kate highlighted this on a prior slide, is that, for a number of years, as I know you're aware, Alok, a number of DR providers have asked for including Sunrun, have asked for valuation of export under the PDR model. And just to say a little bit more about that, what we've heard consistently is that the PDR model is only designed for load drop. It's not designed for export. And we can't have conflicting capacity values. So, the PUC can't set a resource adequacy value of, say, 500 kilowatts. And then we're only able to offer 200 kilowatts to be settled in the KISO market. And that the two essentially have to match, more or less. And so we are, and this is why we also highlighted FERC Order 2222, is that, this model, the DERP model, does allow for injection of energy into the grid from behind the meter resources and front of the meter resources as well. and that there is kind of an increased focus on this model, and yet it was created 5 years ago, or approved by the FERC 5 years ago, I think, to be more specific. And it's not being utilized. And a large part of the reason why is because there is not a qualifying capacity value for aggregated resources, you know, either in front of or behind the meter of different resource types, which was the original vision of the DERP, or for behind the meter aggregated resources, even that are homogeneous. So say all storage resources or all hybrid resources that also inject energy into the grid. So that's one major barrier. The interconnection process is another barrier, but we're asking this proceeding to help us with the first one. With that being said, though, I mean, we certainly would take PDR with allowance of export, but just on everything we've heard over the last few years, it doesn't sound like that is feasible, as Kate mentioned. And also, we still would have, even if PDR did allow for export, we would still run into the same interconnection issue. So Rule 21, we would still have to have a compliant tariff, a compliant interconnection tariff to allow exports into the grid. The wholesale market, rather.
Hey, good afternoon, or good morning. This is Anya Gilbert with the KISO. Rachel and Mark, thanks so much for the presentation. I realize some of this we went over in the working groups themselves, and we raised kind of similar comments there. It sounds like the proposals are going to be refined, and maybe one area to kind of continue thinking about refining is the KISO method itself. I understand you're valuing the storage part of the behind the meter hybrid resource using the storage resources PMAX. And maybe just a note there that, you know, the capability of that resource isn't the same as its contribution to reliability. And if you're modeling it off of kind of the approach for in front of the meter hybrids are using an ELCC based on the August decision from last year. So just a couple of notes as you continue to refine those proposals. Thanks.
Thank you for that.
This is Alok again. If I can follow up on another question. So this is on incrementality. So, you know, there are batteries on TOUs that are doing some partial discharges routinely. So in that scenario, I guess I didn't quite get from your slide that you would be making some adjustment for that in your proposal.
That's one of the things we're considering is how do we account for that? How do we account for consumption? I mean, I would categorize, you know, customer use of energy storage. I think the way that I said it was on-site use of the discharge, but it essentially means the same thing. What we're very wary of doing is setting up some sort of complicated qualifying capacity methodology. Because at least currently, as we understand it, like DERP and NGR don't use baselining. So we're thinking of a way to simplify that. We're thinking of a way to simplify that. And also, and I don't say this to cut off conversation here, but also to make sure we don't use too much time, is that this is one of the issues that we're planning to discuss in the 4-hour workshop that we have scheduled for this coming Tuesday. Yeah, sorry.
Let me just ask one last question. And I don't know if you thought about this, but is there an assumption being made about the retail rates in particular? I mean, I think you saw that 6-step roadmap that we outlined in May last year for hourly dynamic rates. Do you envision your proposal working in that context? Or I just wanted to know if you were making any assumptions about retail rates.
No, I wouldn't say directly. I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't work with retail rates. I don't know if others have comments on that, but we haven't been considering that specifically.
This proposal is largely focused on the supply side versus load modifying swim lane, and we kind of view the 6-step unite idea as more in the load modifying camp. You know, it's a question of if you have a resource that is participating in the market and also taking service on a real-time price, how the battery interaction would be counted within the CEC forecast and RA obligations. So that is a interesting question, but this really focuses on, or it doesn't envision both, I guess. It is more of the supply side avenue. But that's not to say that we don't see promising pathways for providing capacity services through load modifying avenues. That entails a number of other questions and potentially goes back to the bifurcation decision around how a market-informed storage optimization that is not in the market could better count for capacity and get capacity-esque payments based on how the CEC is forecasting and incorporating that response.
Like that's all of the questions. Next up, we have KISO and E3. Anya, go ahead.
All right. Just as a quick audio check, are you able to hear me, Simone?
Yes.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks to Energy Division for the opportunity to present. My name is Anya Gilbert. I'm a lead policy developer at the ISO, and I'm joined this morning with Vignesh Venugopal, a senior consultant at E3. Next slide. So this morning, I'll be reviewing some background on the KISO's current QC counting proposal for demand response before turning it over to Vignesh to discuss an approach we've outlined to implement the proposal. And I will note that E3 has documented this process in a guide, which is linked at the end of the presentation and is included in the CEC supply side demand response QC working group docket. Next slide. So to start with some background on why KISO sees the need for a new QC method and some of the current challenges, to start, we currently have a disconnect between planning and operations. Demand response resources that are used to meet RA requirements are overcounted compared to the availability that we're seeing of those resources, particularly in peak net load hours. And in addition, not all of the RA capacity that's called supply side acts like supply side by being accessible to the KISO, and specifically utility demand response capacity is credited and therefore isn't subject to the KISO's RA must offer obligations, substitute capacity obligations, or the KISO's resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism. And to put some numbers towards this, as of August 2021, about 80% of DR that counted towards system RA requirements was associated with utility demand response programs. And if we take a look at last summer on high load days, this capacity availability fell short of its RA credits by an average of 34%, or 450 megawatts, of the total resource adequacy credits. This includes the 15% planning reserve margin adder, and I'll note that without that adder, it was an average of 17%, or 187 megawatts short. Next slide. So we understand that demand response is variable in that it provides shaped bids and responses. It's use limited as it has call limitations. It's availability limited as it doesn't bid in all hours. But today's RAQC evaluation process doesn't take that into account. And we believe the same disconnect we're experiencing today will persist if we don't change the planning assumptions. So in thinking about a new QC method for demand response, the KISO has put forward principles it believes need to be met, including that its new QC method meets. First, that it represent an accepted industry-leading practice that does recognize DR is limited and variable output nature, that it assess demand response's contribution to reliability across the year or seasons, and that it assesses demand response's interactive effects with other resources as incremental amounts of energy and use-limited resources begin to add less and less incremental capacity value to the system. Next slide. So the KISO's proposal that we have vetted and discussed in the CEC's demand response working group is a proposal that we believe meets the principles I discussed on the last slide, and as a result would qualify for RAIN exemption. And our goal is that this method can be tested in our year 2023 and continue to be used in our year 2024 so that it can be refined for a permanent method in our year 2025. And as a quick overview of the method, we're proposing that Energy Division would assess demand response's contribution to reliability using loss of load expectation to calculate the ELCC of demand response using CERVM. I'll note the KISO had previously proposed that E3 run the ELCC, but utilizing CERVM to calculate the ELCCs of demand response can help ensure we're using the same planning assumptions and can create consistency across the accreditation of all resources in the RA proceeding. And to support Energy Division running the ELCC, we are proposing that the availability of demand response be represented by the load impact protocols under various conditions. And as I mentioned earlier, from a scoping perspective, we're hoping this can be adopted for our year 2023 and 2024 to learn from the process and refine it in order to get to a permanent method in our year 2025. So we're proposing that in our year 2023, this would apply to IOU supply side demand response. And for our year 2024, we're recommending this would apply to both IOUs and third-party demand response resources. And the rationale for waiting a year for third-party DR is really in order to refine implementation. The ELCC studies are computationally intensive and will require significant effort to finalize. We recognize this might be challenging this year from an implementation perspective, and so we are proposing that it be in place for our year 2024. And as I previously mentioned, this approach would qualify for RAIN exemption under KISO's existing variable output demand response policy. And if this method were to be approved, we would be filing that RAIN exemption at FERC. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vignesh to review the method and process with the LIP profile informed ELCC in more depth. I have one more slide on the key milestones. I did want to flag that in terms of looking at the process, if we're looking at calendar year 2022 for our year 2023, I want to highlight how the LIP process overlays with the ELCC process and RA processes. So currently today, the LIP reports are due April 1st. Our proposal when it comes to the LIP-informed ELCC is that from January to March, we could continue to refine the data assumptions and inputs based on CERVM's capabilities. Our understanding from speaking with the utilities and DRPs, but specifically IOUs, is that the timeline between April and May would allow for the LIP profiles to be developed and submitted in order for the ELCC to be run by the CPUC from May through June. It's been estimated to take 6 to 8 weeks. And I'll note that we have been anticipating an RA decision in June. In order to have some feedback in this process, we recognize there could be a comment period from June to July in time for the RA process, July 1st initial RA allocations, the final requirements assigned to LSEs in September, and the final RA compliance filings, which are due in October. So really highlighting how this process can fit within existing timelines, although it is still tight. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vignesh to talk further about the process itself.
Thank you so much, Anya. Hopefully you can all hear me all right. My name is Vignesh and I'm a senior consultant at E3. As Anya mentioned, the guide that will support the implementation of this process is linked at the very end of this deck. And in this presentation, we'll be giving you a high-level overview of all the key steps in that process. So the first step in the process is essentially the input development to help us characterize demand response in SERVM. What's unique about demand response is the fact that it can both be variable and energy limited or call limited in nature. And so the IOUs will help us develop the hourly availability profiles for the demand response programs, as well as define the call constraints. Step 2 in the process will involve aggregating some of these profiles to program levels to keep the process computationally tractable. Step 3 in the process will involve the energy division feeding these inputs into SERVM and calculating ELCCs using a methodology that we'll dig into in just a moment. And the final step in this process is taking the program level ELCCs output from SERVM and then distributing it across any subtypes that may exist, all the LCAs that the program may span across, and it will also help us define the capacity contributions towards meeting LCRs. Next slide, please. So this table gives you an overview of the different programs, the different subtypes, and the LCAs that these programs span across. Today, each of these programs and subtypes get a unique qualifying capacity QC, and we intend to do the same. But next slide, please. To keep the process computationally tractable, what we're proposing is an intermediate step where ELCCs are only calculated for all of the programs uniquely. And then once we have the program level ELCCs, we'll use a simpler heuristic to distribute that program level ELCC to the subtypes and the LCAs that we saw in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the input development. As I mentioned, one piece of the puzzle is capturing the variable nature of demand response. And this is where the load impact protocols come into play. This is why this proposal is called the lib-informed ELCC. Today, the IOUs, to satisfy the load impact protocols, work with the consultants to build models that essentially estimates load impact, i.e. load reduction, as a function of time, weather, etc. And once these models are trained, they are used to estimate the load impact under, quote, 1 and 2 conditions, which then informs the DR and QC today. What we're proposing is to use these trained models to estimate load impacts across weather conditions from 1998 to 2017, and not just the 1 and 2 conditions. 1998 to 2017 are essentially the weather years that SERVM is already set up to model. And doing this will ensure that we can capture the fact that demand response availability may change from day to day based on how sensitive it is. There may be some days where the availability is higher than the 1 and 2. There may be some days where it's lower, and we want to capture both. This will ensure that we have a rich data set that captures DR's availability in a bunch, in a set of hours which may be expected, and it will lead to a statistically rigorous estimate of the capacity value of demand response. Next slide, please. The next piece of the puzzle is capturing the energy limitation or call limitation of demand response programs. So the IOUs will also help us to define call constraints for each program that will be modeled. On a high level, this will include a limit on the number of calls, a limit on the duration of each call, and hours required ahead of a DR resource to be committed. Next slide, please. So thus far, we've covered steps 1 and 2 of the process, which involves the input development and the need for aggregating program subtypes. What we'll now delve into is the ELCC calculation to take place in SERVM and the allocation of interactive effects. So ELCC is the measure of equivalent perfect capacity that can be provided by a resource. It's how we value solar and wind today. And ELCCs can be calculated in a way to account for all the interactions between this one resource that you care about and all the other resources that exist on the system. But these interactive or diversity effects, as they're sometimes called, will all be allocated to a single resource. And so the challenge that remains is, if multiple resources are contributing to the interactions, how do we reasonably distribute this interactive benefit or penalty across all the resources interacting with each other? And so this proposal also includes an allocation method which can be applicable for interactions between resource classes, but also resources within a single class. Next slide, please. Before we delve into what that allocation methodology is, let's ensure that we all understand some terms. First, an ELCC is the measure of the resource's value when it's the only variable or energy limited resource in the system. That's why it's called first in. And this essentially measures the ability of a resource to clip the gross peak, because in the absence of other variable and energy limit resources, the resource introduced will be utilized to clip the gross peak. Conversely, next slide, please. The last in ELCC measures the ability of a resource to provide value given all other resources on the system already exist. In simple terms, what's the value of demand response given all the other resources, solar, wind, storage, hydro, everything else also exists on the system. When we calculate the last in ELCC of demand response, for example, it will capture within itself all the interactions that demand response has with the other resources on the system. But again, since multiple resources are contributing to that interactive effect, we need to think about how to allocate that interactive benefit or penalty across all interacting resources and not just give it all to demand response. Next slide, please. Let's first build a little more intuition about what interaction may look like. So the figure on the left here is showing how solar alone on this illustrative day can reduce the gross peak by 5.2 gigawatts. So the first in ELCC for solar in this example can be viewed as being 5.2 gigawatts. The figure in the middle shows how the first in ELCC for 4-hour storage in this example comes out to be 8.3 gigawatts. The figure on the right shows how having both solar and storage on the system can lead to an ELCC of 15.2 gigawatts. And note that 15.2 is 1.7 greater than 5.2 plus 8.3. In other words, the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts in this example. What's important to note is that interaction doesn't always have to be as direct as it can be perceived to be. So it's not just the fact that excess solar can get stored and then discharged later. Interaction also accounts for the fact that the presence of one resource shifts and changes the needs of the system, which may make it more or less conducive for the next resource to provide value. So the reason we have 1.7 gigawatts of diversity benefit here is because solar is both shifting the net peak in the evening, but also making it skinnier, so to speak. The duration of the net peak in the evening in the rightmost figure is less than the duration in the middle of the day in the figure in the middle. And that leads to limited duration resources like 4-hour storage to provide more value than they could previously. So the question is, how do we allocate this 1.7 gigawatts of diversity benefit to both solar and storage, since they both are contributing to this benefit? One simple idea is to just allocate the 1.7 in proportion to the 5.2 and the 8.3. But there are some weird consequences to that. Next slide, please. Let's just focus on the table on the top for a moment. If the interactive benefit of 1.7 gigawatts were to be allocated in proportion to the 5.2 and the 8.3 that solar alone gets, that storage alone gets, then we end up with a storage ELCC of over 100%, which does not make sense. Let's take a look at the table on the bottom. If we were to hypothetically also expand the scope and introduce a non-interacting resource into the mix, if the resource is non-interacting, then it doesn't interact with solar and storage and thus should not get any benefit. But if we follow the same approach, the non-interacting resource gets a portion of the interactive benefit in solar and storage as well, which again does not make sense. And so, next slide, please. What we're proposing here is a method we've dubbed the delta method to allocate the portfolio level interactive benefits and penalties to all interacting resources. Delta implies difference, and on a high level, we are proposing that the portfolio level interactions be allocated to resources in proportion to the difference between the first and the last in ELCC for each resource. Let's walk through these steps one by one. Step number one involves calculating the portfolio level interactive effects. So the portfolio ELCC in the blue bar here is essentially what you get for all the resources in aggregate. We take the sum of last in ELCCs calculated for each resource, and when we subtract that from the portfolio ELCC, the gap that remains is the portfolio interactive effects, the orange. And that's essentially the incremental benefit or penalty you get, which needs to be allocated to all the interacting resources. Step number two involves calculating the interactive effects with respect to each resource. So we'll calculate the first in ELCC of each resource, the last in ELCC for each resource, and the difference between the two is essentially the interactive effect with respect to each resource. And this step will be repeated for each resource that's part of the study. Step number three involves taking outputs from step number two and then scaling them in proportion so that the sum of the individual interactive effects sums up to the portfolio level interactions calculated in step one. And once we do that, step number four is simply summing up the loss in ELCC for each resource plus the adjusted interactive effect, the output from step number three. And that yields the final ELCC credit in orange in step number four. And that's the final ELCC, which accounts for each resource's interactions with the others in a reasonable way. So what's good about this process is the fact that it helps us avoid the weird consequences highlighted on the previous slide. By definition, both the first and the last ELCCs are less than equal to 100%. And it can be mathematically proven that the final ELCC credit using the delta method will either lie exactly at or somewhere between the first and the last ELCCs, i.e., the delta method-based ELCC will always be less than equal to 100%. So the concern of ensuring non-interacting resources do not get a share of the interactive benefits, let's take a look at step number two. The interactive effect for each resource is calculated as the difference between its first in ELCC and the last in ELCC. And for a resource that does not interact with anything, both the first in and the last in ELCC will be the exact same. And so since the interactive effect for each resource, for that resource will come out to be zero, it just won't get any share of the portfolio level interactions either. Next slide, please. The delta method can be used to both calculate an ELCC for the DR class as a whole and an ELCC for each DR program that we previously outlined. Unfortunately, we do not have the time to walk through each step in detail here, but there's a slide titled Resources at the very end of this deck, which will link you to a concrete numerical example that we encourage you to check out. So what we've covered thus far is development of the inputs with the help of the IOUs. We've discussed the need to aggregate some of these profiles to get program level data. We've talked about how ELCCs will be calculated in SERVM to get program level ELCCs. What remains is taking this program level ELCC and then distributing it to the program subtypes and the LCAs. Next slide, please. We have a monthly RA construct in California, and the Energy Division calculates and publishes monthly solar and wind ELCCs today. And so keeping in line with that process, they will also be calculating program level ELCCs for each DR program to be modeled. And what we'll have from SERVM is a monthly ELCC for each program. And then we'll distribute that program level ELCC in each month to all the LCAs and the program subtypes based on their availability in critical hours observed in SERVM. Let's take a simple example. Let's say in one specific month, demand response was required to be dispatched in 4 hours in SERVM. Let's say a DR program of interest P spans across 2 LCAs, LCA A and LCA B. The hourly availability for each of these LCAs will be defined uniquely. And if we find that program P in LCA A could provide 800 megawatt hours in these 4 hours, and that P in B could also provide 800 megawatt hours of reduction in these 4 hours, then they simply get 50% of P's total ELCC for that month. If we find that P in A could provide twice the amount of reduction as P in B in these 4 hours, then P in A also gets twice the ELCC as P in B does. Once these LCA level ELCCs are calculated, they can be used to both meet the system level requirements and also the local capacity requirements. And this is consistent with how system-wide solar wind ELCCs are calculated today, and DR and QCs are calculated towards meeting the 1 and 2 peak needs of the system, but they also help account towards meeting the local capacity requirements today. Next slide, please. So to recap, step 1 involves input development. The IOUs will help develop hourly availability profiles using the load impact protocols, and they will also help us define call constraints. Step number 2, program subtypes and LCAs will be aggregated to get program level profiles to keep the process computationally tractable for now. Step number 3, the Energy Division feeds SERVM with all of these inputs. ELCCs are calculated for each month, for each program, and interactive effects are allocated based on the delta method. And finally, step number 4, the program level ELCCs are allocated to each program subtype, if any, and the LCAs, so that each of them get a unique qualifying capacity as they do today. Next slide, please. Linked here are a few resources for further reference. The first one will direct you to the DR ELCC guide in its entirety. The second and third resources will dig further into the details associated with the delta method and help you build a better intuition using illustrative examples. And yeah, that's all we have for you, and we're happy to take questions and comments in the remaining time. Thank you.
I see a question in the chat. from Matt Barmack, how does LIP-informed ELCC translate to slice of day, if at all?
Sure. So our proposal here is really focused on the interim method for our year 2023 and 2024. I understand slice of day is still under development. So I think that's still to be determined, and we're continuing kind of that examination in the CEC's working group process.
Let's go to Luke Tugas.
Hi, thank you, Anya and Vignesh, for the presentation. Definitely appreciate it. I have several questions. I'll just hit on one or two for now, and then give other folks a chance to speak. First, broader question: how would this proposed methodology compare to what was used by the ISO in the autumn? I think it was August or September of last year, when you applied an ELCC analysis on top of the utility LIP-based DRQC values.
Yeah, I can take that question, and Anya, feel free to chime in at any point. A few differences. From a model standpoint, E3 used recap. E3 is a loss of load probability model in that study. We're now transitioning to using SERVM to ensure consistency across the different work streams at play here. When it comes to the data that defines the hourly availability of demand response in these models, we have previously used the DR bids, the actual bids placed in the KISO markets, as a proxy for the hourly availability. And those bids only span across 1 year. What we're now proposing to use is hourly availability profiles that are output from the models built to satisfy the load impact protocols. And these will span across multiple weather years as well. And let me think what other differences exist. One of the differences is the fact that the ELCCs previously published were either based on a first-in basis alone or a last-in basis alone. First-in ELCC, as I mentioned, does not account for interactions between DR and everything else. Last-in ELCC implies all of the interaction is allocated to demand response. What we're now proposing is using the delta method to ensure that we are accounting for interactions, but those interactions are being allocated to all the resources which contribute to that interaction. And let's see, what else?
I think that captures it, Vignesh. I'd only just kind of reinforce that notion of, by expanding the number of weather years, you're looking at DR under many more conditions. And so in some ways, this is a much more liberal approach than the use of bids, which was done in 2020.
Mm-hmm. One final comment. So in our previous studies, we've directly compared ELCCs to NQCs to just highlight the gap that exists. But I want to make it very clear that in this study, the NQC itself will not be used in any way. What we're using is the model that estimated the NQC, if that makes sense. The model that the IUs and the consultants built is trained to estimate load impacts under some conditions, right? And then it is fed with the 1 and 2 conditions, which then outputs the NQC used today. But we are taking that model and feeding it with a wide array of weather conditions over and beyond the 1 and 2 to get a richer data set and a more statistically reasonable estimate. So the ELCCs here will be based on the load impact protocol model and not the NQC itself. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Vignesh and Anya, for that response. That is helpful. And the reason why I brought this up is that it's really critical that whatever method you're putting forth get tested properly. And because, I remember last year, the ISO was very bullish on using their ELCC methodology at that time. But however, when they performed their analysis on the utilities, lit-based values last fall, it delivered what I would characterize as very highly inconsistent results. And just for example, for a given program, let's say PG&E's capacity bidding program, that was the change in the ELCC-based QC values relative to the lit-based QC values varied significantly from one LCA to the next. It was, in one, for instance, it was over 400%, and the other one, it was like 30-something%. So in our view, that raised a lot of red flags for us in terms of the accuracy of that methodology. And so I would urge you to put in a lot of due diligence on this particular approach to ensure that that this isn't just a case of false precision. And because if it's resulting in a similar result or outcome, because as what was used last time, then I think that's going to create a whole lot of problems for the DR community, DR providers, because it's simply going to further decrease the amount of transparency in the current DR QC process. And then my second question, sorry, go ahead.
Can I quickly respond to that, Luke, before we get to the next question?
Sure.
Your point is very well taken. I just wanted to help build some intuition for why those numbers seem as wacky as they were. So what was used to define the hourly availability profiles in that iteration of the study were the DR bits themselves, right? Which were placed in 2020, which may or may not have the same weather as the weather is modeled in the study. And now we are ensuring that the load, solar, wind model in SERVM comes from the same years that we are also requesting the IOUs to develop our hourly availability profiles for. So there's consistency now between the weather that define the load, wind, solar, and the DR availability. So there's consistency there, and so the weather variation should now be lower. But something else I'd like to note is the fact that one of the reasons why the ELCCs were so widely different from the NQCs, because the ELCCs were again based on the bids, and there's a time difference between when the NQCs are calculated and the bids are placed. Enrollments can change, for example, right? So yeah, it's also, the numbers were as wacky as they were because enrollments changed between when the load impact protocols were followed, the NQCs calculated, and when the bids were placed. And so for all of this to work, for us to bridge the gap between expectation and reality, at some point the bids will need to be consistent with what you expected them to be when you calculated the NQCs. Does that make sense?
I think so, but it does raise, another kind of suggestion that what's been lacking in this, what's missing in this current proposal, as well as past versions of the ELCC proposals, is a proper narrative, a proper discussion about these points. I'm looking at the ISO's proposal that they submitted the other day, so, that you're presenting on today, and it's a couple of pages, and your slideshow here is good, and it provides a lot of detail, but there's no robust discussion about why this approach is actually better than anything else, right? And from my perspective, that's always been lacking with the ISO, the LCC proposals. It's always been a discussion about the concept, but never about why it actually is superior to other approaches, and so just some food for thought. I'll just leave it at that. Mm-hmm. And then the other question I have is more logistical, and what about the timeline that would be used for this process? I know I think it was maybe earlier on the slide, excuse me, in the presentation, Anya had presented a timeline for this year, but I'm curious as to what that would look like on a regular basis if this were adopted. And the reason why I bring that up is that as it stands now, using just the lit-based process, and this is not a criticism of the Energy Division. I realize that they have a lot of important work to do, but the DR providers, they did not get their NQC values until I believe September, when the timeline in the WIP, the load impact protocol filing guide had I think July 1 as the date, if I recall correctly. If I'm getting it wrong, forgive me. But the point is that that's under just the lit-based process. What this is going to do is it's going to extend this whole NQC process by maybe another month or two, maybe. I'm just guessing. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. And so I'm also concerned that this could end up resulting in DR providers getting their NQC values at the end of October, which, as we all know, is when the year-ahead filings are due. And as it stands now, it's challenging for the DR providers to contract earlier on, once the LSCs receive their preliminary RA requirements. That's the very hamstrung in that regard as under the current process. But this is just going to make it that much more difficult. So, something to think about as well. In terms of making this a process something that can work for the DR community. Thank you.
Luke, I think some of those comments, I understand that there is a tight timeline. I do want to direct us back to kind of the scope of the proposal for our year 2023. We are suggesting that for our year 2023, this is for IOUs, and suggesting we consider how to develop and refine it to best reflect it for third-party use in the future. So I want to be clear about the scope that we're proposing here, if that helps. And then in terms of the discussion around it being a superior method or why we strongly believe it should be used, I can direct you to the many sets of comments we've submitted in the CEC process and in the CPUC process where we've outlined that. And I addressed that at the beginning of the presentation as well. So happy to talk further about that, but I thought at least the scope kind of focus for IOUs might help you and the folks you represent. Well,
the problem is, though, is that the scope, as you clearly indicated, was also focusing on 2024 when third-party providers would be expected to be subject to this regime. And so it's something that I think should be figured out now, this time around, rather than waiting for a future time, because as we've seen with the DR testing rules, sometimes things fall through the cracks and they don't make it into the next RA proceeding. And so, I wouldn't be so sanguine about that issue. I think it should be considered now, so that there is transparency and assurance, for the DR community that the timeline would work for them. And then in terms of the other comment you made, I realize we could go back and forth on this, and so I won't go too much into it. But the reason why I'm saying today that I don't feel that the ISO has made a convincing case that ELCC is superior than any others, that's based on everything that the ISO has submitted in the past, and so that's definitely an informed opinion. And on that note, I would point out, and this could be used error on my part, but the link at the end of your slide deck, where there's an example to a real life kind of analysis with the DR program. The link isn't working for me, and I'm not sure if that's the case with other folks. And again, that might be user error on my part, but just something to mention as well. Thank you.
Yeah, we can check and follow up on that.
Thanks for flagging that.
Yeah.
We have Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul on behalf of CLICA. So I've got some questions on two topic areas. One, you're proposing this for 2024, which is when slice a day is scheduled to be implemented. So what modifications would be needed for this to be compatible with the slice a day framework? I don't see that mentioned here.
I think some of that is set to be discussed in the CEC working group process as they outlined in their draft report.
So you don't, and so in this, you don't have any discussion on how this would work under slice a day then?
My understanding is slice of day is still being developed and discussed and hasn't been decided on. So there isn't a discussion on that yet to be.
But the timeline is to
proposed
implement
method.
slice. The current timeline is to implement slice a day in 2024 compliance year. So, okay. So my next area of questions is on the process. So I think if you go to page 6. So is there going, in this schedule, what sort of commission authorization or decision would be needed to require the lit profiles to be submitted on May 2nd? I mean, that's a function that utilities don't do. My understanding is they hire consultants to do the load impact protocols. So to generate 20 load impact protocols for each DR program would probably cost additional money from the consultants. And so what is the process that would have a commission decision or something prior to May 2nd that would authorize that? Is that, what is that? Do you know?
You know, I would defer to Energy Division there.
Okay.
From the CEC's working group process, this is an option for our year 2023. And so for those utilities that would elect to use this method, that would receive rate exemption, they would have the opportunity to submit their lit profiles and have their ELCZs calculated.
So this is an option then, whether they would submit the profiles and want to use this.
We are recommending that it is the option. I'm also cognizant of the CEC's working group efforts and, you know, their recommendations made to the CPUC as well.
Okay. So in the other thing of so the May, you said 6 to 8 weeks to run that. So if I understood the step, there was 4 steps. So does that mean for each DR program, you'd have to run the model like 2 times, 3 times in the process? I mean, maybe, I guess if maybe for Vinesh, if you could offer some insight of for each DR program and your steps, how many times do you have to run that for the 20 years?
Yeah, each DR program will have to be evaluated twice, once on a first-in basis, once on a last-in basis, and in each month to ensure that we get a monthly ELCC.
Okay, so twice for each DR programs with a 20-year times for every DR program. Okay, so and when you had an earlier meeting with you know, Energy Division, and I sort of asked the question of how long that might take, and the Energy Division rep didn't quite know because they hadn't done this before. I mean, is there new information that this can actually be done in 6 to 8 weeks?
So 6 to 8 weeks is the estimate that was given to us in prior discussions, but unfortunately, Donald Brook, who will be leading the modeling effort from the Energy Division, isn't on the call right now. So we can't have confirmed that right now, but that's the estimate that we received based on our previous discussions.
Okay. And then what really puzzles me on this is, so you'd have these ELCC runs done between May and June, and then they would be announced in a commission decision, but a comment period on those results would be after the commission approves these results. I'm really puzzled on that. I mean, one of the things in the decision last year that was very clear that, you know, an ELCC method is the results need to be reviewed by parties to be able to comment. And so adopting these values in a decision without any opportunity for parties to see these things and vet them and validate them, that would prior, you know, it needs to occur prior to a commission decision, but your timeline has that being afterward. So I'm really puzzled on the process on this point.
I think some of that process may need to be kind of further worked out with Energy Division in terms of if the ruling would be on the process rather than the number. And so I think that's something to be aware of as well in terms of what might be in the RA decision.
So you're saying that the June decision would approve a process that's already occurred, and then actual numbers would come in a later decision?
I think that is a possible scenario.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for what Energy Division or what the commission might put in that decision.
Okay. I also find it odd that the commission approves a process that's already occurred. I mean, you know, resources have to be expended to do this, both by the utilities and internally by the Energy Division. And it seems odd to me that you would, you know, make that requirement after it's already been done to evaluate it. I just find the whole process in terms of their approval and what's being done to be very odd.
And Paul, I recognize, you know, a similar process for developing the ELCCs for wind and solar took time. We're developing new processes here, new methods. And so we're recognizing that we'd like to test and refine that. This is a proposal for our year 2023. And I, you know, take your comments in terms of, you know, yes, timelines are tight, and, you know, there is an open question in terms of, you know, what will be in that ruling, and I can't speak to that.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Thanks, Paul. Let's go to Jennifer Chamberlain.
Hi, thanks. Jennifer Chamberlain with C-Power. Can you guys hear me?
Go ahead,
Yes,
Jennifer.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. I've had so many different things muted and unmuted. I wanted to make sure I wasn't just going to talk to myself. So I know I've been, as well as you, Anya, have been participating in the CEC process. I'm a little puzzled because this is something that has come up in the CEC process where we've been asked, you know, for options, and you know, that's morphed a little bit. So LIP-informed ELCC is an option for 23 that the utilities have wanted, that's in the draft report. There are other methodologies also being proposed, you know, that could be used in 23 or perhaps 24. It sounds like from your proposal, you provided an optionality or a IOU only to try and ease, as you were telling Luke, kind of concerns of third parties. But it sounds like you're asking for the commission to go ahead and approve LIP-informed ELCC for everybody for 2024 as part of this proposal. A lot of us are trying to get away from LIP, period, as you know, that's only done here and is not the way you would normally qualify RA resources in other places. Are you tying wanting ELCC to wanting LIP? Or I believe that I've heard KISO say, you know, other areas are using an ELCC, but they're not using it on LIP, they're using it on their other qualification methodology. So I'm trying to understand the genesis of, you know, pre-asking for authorization for 24 for everyone to use this at the same time where we are within the CEC process looking at other possible ways of qualifying capacity, pure LIP-informed ELCC, something else with ELCC, I don't know. I'm just trying to understand, kind of, it feels a little bit like an end run around what we're doing there.
Sure, thanks, Jennifer. So the goal here is to test and refine, recognizing that in this instance, we're proposing that it is LIP-informed. And I think the timeline proposed is really in recognition that if we apply LIP profile informed ELCC for our year 2023, the results won't be really available for us to examine and see if there are improvements needed until we're in calendar year 2024. And so in recognition of the long lead times, we're looking at a 2-year timeline? And then to your second point around, is the KISO tied to using lit profile as the availability input? Again, in that test and refine context, we'd like to start with the lit profile and understand, is that the right proxy for availability that we should be utilizing in the future as well? I hope that helps.
It does, although my question and concern is, saying that you kind of want pre-authorization on this for 24 for third parties. I understand wanting to test and refine the question mark around the ELCC side and the lead times for qualifying capacity for for DR themselves are one of the biggest reasons where my company is, concerned about DR qualifications, and I think I'm not alone in the third party sector there. Fast resource to build, really hard resource to qualify. So I am a little concerned about trying to end run around this. It doesn't sound like this is a proposal you want just for IOUs for 2 years. And it seems like that's tied a little bit to wanting those resources on the supply plan. As a third party, my resources are already on the supply plans. And I know we're trying to test out the ELCC on top of the LIP and how that works. I'm a little concerned about a proposal that kind of pre-pulls us into something with super long lead times that we're already trying to work through. So want to share that timeline is still, and I'll file formal comments as well. But the current LIP process was so prolonged that it actually made doing it essentially moot because we didn't know what we had until after year ahead showings pretty much. And then adding something like this to it, I don't see it getting better for 24. So anyway, I'll just want to make sure I was understanding. So thanks for giving me the time.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Let's go to Amani Hamid. Or Rivera while we wait for Amani. You both should be able to unmute.
Hi, this is Amani. Can you hear me?
You can.
Hi, this is Amani from LEAP. I have a two-part question. One is, how does KISO plan to address the lack of transparency issue that makes it difficult for DRPs like LEAP to conduct future business planning, given that Servum is not open source and we can't run these calculations on our own without either the help of a consultant or inputting numbers into a model that we don't have any access to?
Sure. So I will flag that, this process of, or the methodology of using ELCC is used today for wind and solar resources. And so it is comparable in that it isn't an open source solution. I think the one area in terms of, examining how the ELCCs can be increased is really looking at kind of the availability and increasing that over time. I don't know if Vignesh, you want to add anything there on the transparency question that Amani raised.
Yeah, Servum is an Astrape model, so I, belonging to E3, can't comment on how we may be able to make parts of it transparent or not. But what we could do is maybe, again, this is contingent on how much staff time and availability we can get from the energy division to do this, but put together some charts and figures that show what the critical periods are and how the availability of a DR program may or may not align with it, which leads to a higher or lower ELCC than expected, for example.
Okay, thank you. And the second question I have is, if through the analysis it's found that the loss of load hours are different from the availability assessment hours as defined by the CPUC, how will our availability be affected by the ELCC calculation? And do you think it's fair to judge a DRP's portfolio based on hours that were not considered in the program design?
Can someone help me understand what these availability hours exactly are?
Currently they're 4 to 9 p.m. Monday through Saturday.
Okay. So if those hours were based on past LOLP studies, then I don't think the critical hours that we see now will be significantly different from them. And I'm assuming that it's dynamic, that it's not set in stone, that these availability hours are revised from year to year based on the system's needs changing. I'm assuming at some point these availability hours were in the middle of the day because the growth peak occurs in the middle of the day, and at some point we shifted later into the evening because the abundance of solar shifted the net peak into the evening. So I think the availability window is dynamic and something that may keep changing over time, and with it, the DRQC evaluation will also be consistent with the critical hours. But your point is very well taken that we need to ensure that both of them are consistent to ensure that DR programs are designed to operate and provide value in the hours where they're truly needed.
Yeah, thanks. And one comment to that, even if the availability assessment hours were to shift, there would be a lag between the DR availability assessment because we would be using data from the year prior, which would be for the old availability assessment hours, and you would be modeling for the new availability assessment hours for which we don't have data as yet. And so there would be some issue with regards to that and how we would handle that. Just something to think about.
For sure.
That's a great point, Amani, in terms of the timeline. I think another aspect is by using the LOLE, it can help guide when those program hours should be adjusted or changed to really capture more of the loss of load event hours.
Yeah, and I think that in theory is great. I just want to make sure that when we're not being penalized for performing according to program rules, and then the program rules change, and now we no longer are able to get NQC because we don't have our resource was aligned to a different program standard.
All right, I see a few more hands up. I don't know if we can unmute Art.
Are you there, Art? Let's go to Maria.
First, this is Maria from Home Connect. First, I just want to briefly echo Jennifer's comment. I was a bit surprised to see this proposal put forward into the RA proceeding separately from the CEC working group report, because it seemed to me that that was the venue to work out this issue, and especially for 2024, and introducing it separately does feel a bit like going around that process, which, regardless of how we feel about the methodology, just introduces some confusion. So I'm just going to leave that there. I also want to echo Amani's point regarding transparency. There is a difference here between wind and solar. Wind and solar uses output as inputs output as inputs into the model. Energy output, which is a non-controversial number, as an input into the model. They know what it is. They know what what a resource's output actually was. And then, we can discuss whether or not the modeling itself is transparent or whether it should be. For a DR resource, if you're using LIP profiles, the determination of those in judgment by Energy Division, the way that they judge LIP reports today, is very murky. And what we get and what we are approved for is often not what we submit in the ex ante. So you're taking something that is already a modeling exercise, potentially revised by Energy Division staff, and then put into another model. So it's like uncertainty on top of uncertainty. So I do understand the comparison of wind and solar, but it's not completely the same because there's not that much uncertainty as there is with DR. And regarding that, just looking back at the timeline, I think Jennifer mentioned this last year and prior to this, we submitted our reports in the spring and our QC values were approved in September. Here we are asking for the LIP profiles, which is an input into the QC values, to be approved in May. That is, that's a month. So one of two things would have to be true for that to work. One is the ex ante profile would have to be taken as is, i.e. not amended by Energy Division staff the way that our LIP results are right now, or Energy Division staff would have to commit to reviewing and approving LIP profiles in a month. So I just want to make sure that this is like a very complicated process on top of a very complicated process. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that and that it is different from wind and solar in that aspect.
Thank you, Maria. Is Art available?
How about Naor?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, it just told me I was muted for a second. So are you proposing, one is I think that I am concerned about this I'm not saying there's no way to make it compatible with slice of day, but I'm concerned with like a 1-year method that is potentially not at all compatible with slice of day and going through a whole new model before it has to be changed again. Second question is, how are you proposing to value either new programs or new resources or resources that have very substantial changes from year to year? And I guess somewhat related on that note is for third party, is each DRP going to be evaluated as if that's a program, or is it by resource level, or is it just like all third parties get the same allocation based on the aggregate performance? I presume it would be
Thanks,
that
Nor.
everyone who files a LIP would get like their own kind of QC evaluation.
So let me start with your first question. For slice a day, we still don't have the ultimate design of what it will look like. And that framework hasn't been completely worked out. And when it comes to your question on, new programs or design, I think that there's a timing aspect there in terms of, if it has a LIP or if it's a case where there's programs that are either kind of increasing or decreasing customers, and that would come into play in terms of some scaling. Vignesh, did you want to add anything?
No, I think the granularity will be somewhere in the middle. It would be very, very suboptimal to have a single ELCC for all of third-party DR because we totally understand and want to ensure that the unique program characteristics are captured well. But it may also be overkill to have a unique ELCC for each single resource. Like I don't think we can expect the Energy Division to have enough time to, get a unique ELCC for each DR resource, for each DR participant. We have a single solar and wind ELCC today, for example. At some point, we may calculate multiple ELCCs for different technology types, but I don't think we'll ever get to the point where each solar farm or each wind farm gets its own ELCC. So yeah, it's a trade-off between accuracy and staff time, and we'll ultimately have to defer to them, but I think that what we'll end up with is somewhere in the middle, where it's not a single ELCC for all of third-party DR, but it's not a single ELCC for each unique participant either, if that makes sense. And I also like to note that ELCC calculation is, in this proposal, for example, an intermediate step, right? Like, so it's possible to get an aggregated ELCC in some way, shape, or form, and then use a simpler heuristic to allocate it to each participant based on their unique characteristics.
Thanks. I'm still a little unclear. So you're not, I don't think every resource ID would get its own one, but you think that if every DRP got its own ELCC, that would still be too much?
I can't comment on that, I'm sorry, because I've never run Servum. It's an Astrapi model that the Energy Division is going to run for us, so we're going to have to defer to them on that.
Okay, thanks.
But I will say this, I'm going to use the opportunity to say this. It would really help us and the Energy Division if the third parties could somehow help us understand what the unique characteristics are and like work with us to like come up with a proposal in terms of this would be a reasonable way to aggregate up 100 different programs, for example.
Thanks.
All right, let's go back to Luke again.
Yes, thank you. This has been an informative discussion. More of a technical question. Would you mind going to slide 12, please? And this kind of caught my ear. Thank you. This caught my ear during the early part of the discussion. Vignesh, can you explain how the notification time for a DR program affects the ELCC?
That's a good question. This is an input that exists in Servum, but not in Recap. And so I can't really speak to how exactly the unit commitment logic works in Servum. But let's see. I can't speak for how it will be applied to demand response and whether it will impact results or not. But just thinking from a traditional system operation standpoint, if a coal unit, for example, requires a day ahead notice to be ready to go when you need it the next day, then you can't expect it to ramp up and generate at the desired level if you just notified it 1 hour before it was required, right? And so that is like a scenario where this constraint could be applied and used. But I don't know what the notification periods are for demand response and the details of the unit commitment logic and Servum, so I can't give you any more details on that front.
Okay, thank you for that.
Luke, here we're just trying to represent, this is an input to Servum. It would be a piece of information that would need to be collected from IOUs in 2023.
But it would impact the ELCC. Let's say a short, long notification time versus a short one. Would that have an impact on the ELCC?
It may, based on the unit commitment dispatch and how long the notification period is. But yeah, can't give you an exact assessment of the extent of impact it will have.
Got it. I think this touches on a broader issue, and I think maybe if it was Amani or Maria who touched on this, there's a strong need for there to be more transparency in the DRQC process. And regardless of what methodology or multiple methodologies the commission, PC may approve either on an interim basis or long-term basis, one thing that's really necessary is a more transparent approach. Whatever that happens to be, there needs to be more transparency. And, if for a DR provider to not know, or a utility to not know, or even the PUC to not know, what the optimal inputs should be, or capabilities of a DR program should be, of course, within the guidelines of what's possible, what customers are capable of doing and willing to do, then it makes it really difficult, because then it ends up being this thing where, a situation where a DR provider puts in their inputs and then with no real idea as to what they're going to get out of that. And if there's no sense of the sensitivity, associated with these parameters, then, how can they develop the best portfolio that they can provide? For instance, is it better to reduce the notification time by 2 hours, or is it, do you get a better result by increasing the number of monthly calls from, I'm just making up numbers here, 10 to 11? It's that sort of kind of sensitivity that is completely untransparent, but this is what the DR community needs. They need to know what is going to be the optimal portfolio that each of them can put together. And however way this plays out, if the commission does approve this, then I really hope that somebody puts together a model that will give that transparency to people, to the DR providers and utilities if they're interested in it. And because otherwise, it's just replacing one non-transparent crapshoot process with another one. Thank you.
Thank you all. We're going to have to move on to our next presentation. Paul Nelson from KISO.
Hi, this is Paul. Just to sound check if people can hear me.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So why don't we go on to the next slide? Yes, for people who may not know, the California Large Energy Consumers Association is made up of industrial customers. They're high load factor. Kind of examples of some of the industry would be cement, air gas products, pipeline services, cold storage. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the customers we are. Back up to, again, we're still on who is KISO. The BIP program makes up a very significant portion of the utility DR programs, and the KISO members in turn make up a very significant portion of BIP. So we have a very vested interest in the program to ensure that it's accurately counted and to maintain the reputation on that program. So why don't we go to the next slide? So I've developed something called LIPT, informed by loss of load expectation. And we can use the loss of load expectation results, and I will have an example of what that means and what the numbers look like in a later slide. But we can use these hourly loss of load expectation results to apply as weights to the hourly load impacts. And what this can do is essentially capture the value difference of a load reduction that occurs perhaps later in the evening around net peak compared to one that occurs earlier in the day. It's because there is a value difference of the hours, and that gets captured in this proposal. And again, one of the interesting things about the loss of load expectation result is that it incorporates all the weather scenarios, resource availability of all the resource. So the interactive and saturation effects that was talked about earlier are captured and embedded into the loss of load X results. So to the extent you have a lot of solar on the system, it would explain why we no longer see loss of load expectation that occurs in the early afternoon. It has essentially disappeared if you looked at those results from 10 years ago. And this result would, by using this method, we would avoid some of the modeling, intensive modeling and forecasting results that are necessary for the proposal that we just heard. And I'll show you some on the next slide, but what I'm proposing here is we use these weights for the summer months of June to September, and that we would continue to use the status quo of the load impact protocols for the non-summer months. And I'll explain, I think it'll hopefully become clear in the next slide why that's the case. Thank you very much. So now we have is some loss of load expectation results. And this is from the KISO study that they did on for DR that they posted last June or July. I believe they posted it. And so what we see here is, as we would sort of expect, most of the loss of load expectation is in the summer months. For interesting, it's very concentrated in September. And we see that pretty much it occurs from hour ending 17 through hour ending 22, and it's really concentrated. The bulk of it is in a 3-hour period. And that's why I'm suggesting that we use this. I'm suggesting we use the grand total line as the weights, and that go ahead and apply them through equally through June through September, even though in this analysis it doesn't show, June through August really being a problem month, but nevertheless, I still think we should apply it to the other months. But the modeling does show that these winter impacts are all 0. So trying to use these summer weights in non-summer months because of the hour of the day and when outages, if you were even to have a shortage in winter months, applying these weights really doesn't work well if you were going to do that for like a January because of what the load pattern is. So this works for summer. It doesn't necessarily work for winter. Let's see, so I covered everything here I wanted to on this slide. Oh, just some background on the things, what was provided to me, or what was provided on the website, I should say, was 24 hours of loss of load for each month, and it doesn't seem to be there's a weekend or weekday distinction. So why don't we move on to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm getting an example of actually how this would work. And what I've done here is I've compared 2 programs from Southern California Edison. One is the base interruptible program, which is those industrial customers. And what we see here is the load reduction, because of these are such high load factors, it doesn't vary. The hourly load impacts in a call are almost identical. And today we take a simple average of that from the 4 to 9 p.m. or hour ending 17 through 21, and it would be 496 megawatts. Now, if I use these loss of load expectations as the weights, and I apply that into it's in the yellow box to a 6-hour call, I still get the same number, and that's because of that flat load shape. The other column is Edison's summer discount plan for commercial customers, which is an AC cycling program. And in this case, it's for an assumed call from 4 to 9 p.m. or from hour ending 17 through hour ending 21, which is that 4 to 9 p.m. And what's interesting here is we do see differences in hourly impacts. And 2 things that are going on behind this is, one, it's commercial load. And so you may have, when you hit the evening hours, these commercial events, they shut down maybe the air conditioner. So the load itself, underlying load, can drop off. That's one explanation. The other explanation can be sort of fatigue effects. My understanding with AC cycling programs, you get the biggest impact when that's first called in the hour, and then due to fatigues, you can get drop-offs. So in this case, today we take the average of that 4 to 9 p.m. and you'd get 19.79 megawatts. But if I apply the weights, you get a slightly lower value because that 28 megawatts is really only being weighted at 1.4%. And you get actually a very slight lower number, 1.8. I will say with some statistics people, they would probably say that's a bit noise in the difference. But it just gives you an idea of how the impacts. I mean, I think it does say that our averaging, for probably most programs are actually called today. I do want to point out in this analysis that the summer discount program is a 6-hour program, not a 5-hour program. And that if you were going to utilize this, you would want to adjust those load impact numbers that's in the yellow. You'd want to extend the call into the hour ending 2022 so that you could capture its reduction in that hour. I wasn't able to do this because I just wasn't very familiar with looking at the data and how you would perform that, but that's one thing that you want to do. So the advantage of this, because we've talked about a lot of transparency, is that you can see how your load impacts get results when you're trying to distill down this to a single number for the month. I mean, if your program all of a sudden gets a load, you can see exactly why it's happened. And it's because your hourly load packs were not in when it was most needed on the system. I mean, that's why it would get a low number. It's very transparent. Why don't we go into the next slide? So let's talk about the key assumptions and the pros and cons. I mean, one of the key assumptions is in this whole thing, and this is kind of exists within the RA program, is that loss of load expectation exists in the hottest week of the month. And that is aligned with the 1 and 2 peak load assumption within the load impact protocols forecast process. Now, if loss of load occurring is cooling in cooler weeks, then we want to have to apply this methodology. We want to go back and align that with an hourly impact that would represent the demand response program during a cooler week. However, I really want to caution if you want to go down that path, because if you're reducing the value of a peaking resource during that hot week due to a cooler week, that doesn't tell you you don't have sufficient resources for that peak. What it's really telling you is there's something going on in this cooler week that needs to get resolved, and that really has to come from the design of the RA program. If indeed cooler weeks of the program, I mean, devaluing a resource that's available during hot weather, like an AC cycling program, isn't the solution, because it doesn't necessarily mean what would get replaced if you devalued it would actually address that cooler week need. So again, the pros on this, I already mentioned the transparency of it. And so that really ties into its program of contributing to the areas when loss of load events occurs. It would eliminate a lot of modeling complexity and cost of the forecasts. And as the example it said, there would have to be, in the prior example, you would have to develop for each and every program 20 different load impact protocols. And as it was mentioned before, the computation, that was Dinesh said you had to run these models twice for each program. So much less cost reduction. And of course, the cons is, well, yeah, it is not as precise as actually applying those 20 weather profiles to whatever the loss of load is in that simulation. But I think this is going to capture and get you very similar results. One thing I haven't covered is where are we going to get the loss of load expectation from? And both the Energy Commission and of course the CPUC does reliability modeling. There is some loss of load expectation results that came out of the Energy Commission's midterm review that was done, and they did some work in the 2022 and 2023 timeline. So that could be a source. And I was hoping to see results today of the Energy Division's loss of load expectation results associated with the planning reserve margin study. So that would be, perhaps two sources of where to get this from. But if we could get that in a fairly early time frame, say in that April-ish, May time frame, I mean, the actual implementation of this is pretty easy. And sort of in my presentation of the proposal, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today, but I'm now go to questions.
Let's go to Matt Barmack.
Matt Barmack from Calpine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hey, this is really interesting. I'm not sure I'm thinking about your proposal the right way, but by sort of focusing on how DR might perform in hours that an LE study shows have loss of load risk. Is that more like akin to an incremental or marginal ELCC approach? Because it seems like the sort of going back to the previous presentation, the end result of an LLE study, it would reflect, sort of how all the other resources are moving around the loss of load risk. So I'm just wondering, one question is it right to think of your approach as, sort of roughly analogous to a marginal ELCC approach? And then second, given that we're not using marginal ELCC for other resources like solar and wind, although, I think there are good arguments that we should be, is it problematic to treat DR differently?
Okay, so one of the things I think your question is, I'm proposing to use a loss of load expectation that includes all resources. So in that sense, the loss of load expectation would sort of remit what would be the incremental, is that how a resource would affect reliability on an incremental or marginal basis. However, I am applying it to the load impact, which is the kilowatt to get the weight, and in some cases that would be closer to what would be known as an average. So I think that answers your question. Does that help answer that perspective?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sort of thinking that I mean, and this is a very loose notion, but if you did a side-by-side comparison, your approach might look a lot like the last in that Vignesh just described for sort of the LIP-informed ELCC, but that could be wrong.
I think that's the case if I understand what they were saying, what last in represents, but not knowing the details. Looks like Vignesh just put on the chat that said, yes, that is correct. So
yeah, and then I guess I sort of kind of leave everybody with my other question, which is, would it make sense to sort of do DR this way if we're not doing other resources the same way? But I think that's a bigger question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Hi, this is Vignesh. I wanted to chime in real quick and add to the discussion previously. You're right, Matt, that this can be looked at as a proxy of the last in ELCC, wherein it's an efficient way to send the marginal signal in terms of what's the next resource to be added. But yeah, it's not consistent with how solar and wind ELCCs are calculated today, where you try to allocate the interactive effects to all resources contributing and not just the next resource to be added. So that's a larger discussion to be had, but just wanted to confirm that your interpretation was spot on there. In doing this, what we'll be doing is, in some ways, allocating all of the interactive effects to demand response and not the other resources which also contribute to the interaction and lead to the critical hours existing where they do exist.
I don't see any. We have one more presentation from MRP.
That was the bulk of my presentation. I would want to very quickly kind of address some issues of slice a day. So if we can leave on this slide. So the slice a day, workshop process. Go ahead. Yes. This is the slide to be on. Thank you. There's essentially, the slice definition is sort of narrowed down to sort of two proposals. One is to use a peak and a net peak, and then the other would be to use what they call 24, which is a 24-hour profile for each month. So you're looking at needing a resource stack that would be 24-hour profile for each resource in the 24-hour proposal, or you would have a resource stack at peak and net peak. The status quo of what we do today of a single monthly value doesn't work well in either proposal. I mean, one, let's get the 24-hour right away, because if you're going to have 24 hours shape a load to meet, you need a responding 24-hour profile. And in the case of DR, if it's a 5-hour program, you'd want to put it the 5 hours under each hour, 5 hours of load. Now, on the 2-hour one, or the 2-point, is the peak and net peak. If we, and this is the hypothetical program, if I average the results, I get here 128. But what has that done? It's actually undercounting at the peak. It's saying that you could conclude, oh, I need to go get more resources when you really don't. And more troublesome is it says for the peak that, oh, I've got 128 megawatts. I may be resource sufficient for the net peak when in fact you're actually short. And so this would actually discourage going out and get perhaps say a solar with storage facility to meet your profile. And so the proposal that I just did here, because it generates a single month, is something that this would be an interim proposal, and I wouldn't recommend what I've proposed here under a slice a day framework. So I just wanted to add that clarification onto this. So if anyone has any questions on this, I'll be happy to that, and then get to the hopefully there's time for the next presenter.
Hi, Paul. I had a quick question about something else. If you have a minute, do we, Simone?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, great. Paul, can you go back to the slide with an example where you showed how you take the some product of the LOLE column and this is the one. So one of the things that makes demand response really interesting as a resource is the fact that it can be both variable and energy limited. You spoke about the call constraints part of it, which accounts for the energy limitation. But how would we account for the variability of demand response? Like the LOLE column here, for example, right? If you introduce the inputs well, then the LOLE calculation accounted for all the variability and the energy limited nature of all the resources on the system. But the load impact column here does not take into account the variability, right? So how would we address that?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by the variability?
Let's take a specific example. BIP bids, for example, while they're generally very consistent, they may change between weekdays and weekends, right? And there are other programs like Smart AC, which are a lot more weather sensitive, which could change day by day by day. And so while the LOLE may be looked at as capturing the variability, the load impact here does not, right? The load impact here is just under the 1 and 2 conditions.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of your questions kind of gets, some of your concern gets covered by the requirements of a DR program, you know, to be available for what, 4 or 3 consecutive days? I'm not sure. No, I think it's 3 consecutive days. So that sort of captures that. And then it's also required to be available, I think, Monday through Saturday, so the weekends. So, those types of variabilities, there's a certain amount that you have to be available. And I know, you know, there's concerns about frequency of call limitations, and you know, when all the data that I've looked at has shown that at most in a scenario you have maybe 2 or 3 events that occur per year, and to be eligible to count for the DR program, you have to be able to, it's 24 hours per month. So I don't believe the number of call limitations are a binding constraint that would occur as a binding constraint if you were going to do actual ELCC modeling.
For sure, it's just the variability that I'm concerned, that I'm raising concerns about here. Yeah, as long as we have mechanisms in place which ensures that bids are consistent day after day after day. Mm-hmm. And something else that I want to raise is the fact that these values are based on the 1-2 conditions, right? And what if the critical events that align well with the hours in which demand response is called upon are somehow, let's see, more extreme than the 1 and 2. Is it possible that some DR programs may be able to provide more value? While I just want to make it clear that while the fact that demand response has historically been found to underperform by the KISO is what prompted all of this process, I don't think our objective here should just be to be conservative and avoid overcounting DR. I think we want to both avoid under and overcounting demand response, and that is why we proposed developing hourly availability profiles across the 20 years to account for both times when demand response may be able to provide more than we could in 1 and 2 and then less than 1 and 2 as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think my con, I mentioned that, because we are using the 1 and 2 load impacts, that it doesn't consider the fact that, you have a 1 in 10 load impact to match a 1 in 10 load, in weather scenario. I developed this to be something that would address what I thought a lot of KISO's concerns, which is especially looking at, availability of when you need a DR program across time. And I was also looking to something that could be easily implemented and very transparent. And, and is it perfect? No, but, when you're trying to weigh all these pros and cons, I think this is the best approach, given the time constraints, given, the desire for transparency, the cost of modeling. I mean, all these things have to take into account. I mean, if we attempt to chase perfection, we may it may be like a dog chasing its tail. We just never get there. Do you have any more questions?
One more from Matt.
Hey, Paul, just back on slide 5. And I probably should have given you this feedback in the slice of day workshop, but my understanding of the 2 slice approach is that the peak slice is not necessarily focused on stacking up resources to literally meet the peak load. It's sort of like the current requirements that they're based off the peak, but you're still looking at reliability in all hours, and so the appropriate way to count DR towards that requirement under the 2 slice approach would be its ELCC, not literally its performance in the peak hour. Just a nuance, and it probably belongs more appropriately in the slice of day discussion, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, but I think my example I showed out is if if we're concerned about meeting the peak and the net peak, I mean, if you did that, everyone's concerned about the net peak. In an example, I said it would overvalue it. So I struggle with that. Is if the whole idea was moving to slices, it was to get out of just focusing on 1 hour, is to look at more periods of time where because we're moving to a system that has a lot of variable output resources and trying to capture that across time. So I'm kind of puzzled on the 2 slice, if that's what you were gonna, that puzzles me, is to use a single monthly value if you're going to be looking at 2 time periods.
Yeah, well, I think Carrie's on, and maybe she wants to jump in, but I think the proposal is really to have something like the current compliance requirements, but with a separate separate validation for the net peak. And my point is just really focused on, regardless of what you think of the proposal, just sort of the correct interpretation of the proposal. And I don't think you would want to use just the performance of DR in the peak hour to count towards the peak requirement.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Let's go to our last presentation.
Thank you, Simone. This is Brian Baker with Middle River Power. Miriam started with a short, hopefully non-controversial proposal, and I hope that we can end this with a short, non-controversial proposal. So let's go to our single slide. Thank you, Simone. The decision D19-02-022 directed that the ISO, the Commission use the ISO's 1 year out and 5 year out LCR analyses, which they do on an annual basis to inform the multi-year forward requirements. The year one study would inform years 1 and 2, and the 5-year study would inform year 3. And then if there's any transmission upgrades that come in during years 2 and 3, the ISO would incorporate the effect of those upgrades into the year's requirements. And this, I think we did this for a few years, but more recently we have noticed that the Commission is using the ISO's non-technical LCR estimates for years 2 and 3 to set the year 2 and 3 requirements. I guess we probably don't understand if there's a benefit to using those non-technical analyses. We tend to think that technical analysis produces superior numbers. And these other non-technical analyses use adjustments other than for new transmission projects. So our simple proposal is we'd love the Commission to clarify and memorialize the process for establishing the multi-year forward local capacity requirement. And then we'll stick to that going forward. We don't think it's in anybody's interest that the ISO goes through a very technical process to come up with numbers, and then the Commission looks at those numbers and says, well, we're not sure if we're going to adopt them. They might be a little high. We just think that introduces a lot of uncertainty into the whole process and could lead to additional ISO backstop. In any case, it puts the ISO in a difficult spot if the Commission adopts an LCR number that's lower than what the ISO believes it should be. So that is our proposal, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Given that we're down from 116 attendees at the beginning to 73 or so now, I can't say that I'm surprised to not get any questions, but Simone, Energy Division staff, thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thanks, Brian. I guess I have a question. I'm not understanding why the value would not be what KISO. I mean, since we have always adopted values that KISO recommended, except I suppose in there was the one exception a couple of years ago, Bay Area. It's not, well, these haven't been, for the full study for years 2 and 3, it's been the interpolation. It has been their recommendation.
Yeah, Simone, I guess maybe we don't appreciate it if we've never had a good appreciation of what's involved in producing those non-technical estimates for years 2 and 3, how robust they are relative to the annual LCR process. I mean, I think we'd be happy to have a conversation and better understand what the basis for these non-technical estimates are, and are they truly suitable for using? Certainly happy to have that conversation, but absent that conversation, we'd like the Commission to go back to what they adopted in D19-02-022.
Well, maybe KISO can respond to that in their comments. I'm not seeing any other questions.
That would be great. Yes, Simone, I agree. That would be great for the ISO to clarify what the difference between the technical 1 and 5 year studies and the non-technical estimates are.
I'm sure everyone is eager to get to lunch at this point. So unless there's any other questions or comments, we'll look forward to seeing your comments on the 14th, and you will be hearing from us about scheduling the follow-up workshop. All right, thank you for your participation.